Imagine a city for a second, right? Like a sprawling, bustling, mid-sized American city.
Oh, like a Miami or something.
Yeah, exactly. Roughly the population of Miami, Florida, or maybe Raleigh, North Carolina. But now, take away all the adults.
Oh, okay.
Erase the parents, the teachers, the shop owners, the police officers. Imagine that entire city. Every single resident is a child who has arrived completely alone.
That is a staggering image.
It really is. And over a span of just 4 years, that is exactly what happened. I mean, more than 475,000 unaccompanied children crossed the United States border.
Yeah, the scale is just massive.
Right. And now, the new administration has stepped up to the podium with this claim that absolutely, stops you in your tracks.
Yeah.
They're telling the public that over 300,000 of those children are just missing.
Unaccounted for.
Completely unaccounted for. Potentially lost to this shadowy underworld of labor and sex trafficking. It is a terrifying premise.
It really is, yeah.
But before we dive into the machinery of how a modern government could potentially misplace the population of a mid-sized city, I want to take a quick second to talk directly to you, our listener.
Yes, definitely.
If you rely on us to parse through these massive, complex stories, please make sure to like, subscribe, and follow the show right now. It is honestly the best way to ensure you never miss out when we cut through the noise.
Absolutely.
And speaking of cutting through the noise, just a very brief factual update on the Martin Stevens versus OpenAI matter. Stevens has officially suspended his quiet period following OpenAI's June 8, 2026 confidential S-1 filing.
Right.
There are currently no negotiations taking place, and the dead man switch remains inactive.
And, that kind of abrupt shift in data transparency is actually the perfect lens for what we are looking at today.
Oh, that's a great point.
Because we are dealing with an incredibly charged environment right now, right? You have furious statements from politicians, press briefings, activist organizations on all sides of the political spectrum.
Yeah, it's a minefield out there.
It really is. But our mission for this deep dive is entirely on the structural reality of the data. We are going to impartially examine the exact mechanics of the government's child placement system.
No political spin, just the facts.
Exactly. We need to look at the database architecture that allowed what the Department of Justice is calling super sponsors to operate. We're going to look at the specific legal mandates that forced caseworkers to prioritize speed over safety and, those severe unintended consequences that have materialized now that the new administration has basically slammed the brakes on the entire process.
So I want to start by doing the math on that foundational number, because 475,000 children over a 4-year period is it's just really difficult to visualize.
It's hard to wrap your head around, yeah.
If we break down the ORR data from 2021 through 2024, you were looking at an average of roughly 118,000 children a year.
Right.
That means the system was processing over 320 unaccompanied children every single day, 7 days a week, for 4 straight years.
And you really have to think about the physical and logistical reality of what 320 children a day looks like for an agency.
It's not just a tally mark on a whiteboard.
No, not at all. These aren't just names on a spreadsheet. These are kids who need immediate medical screening, they need clothing, a bed in a federal facility, and an assigned caseworker whose sole job is to track down a viable sponsor in the United States.
Which is a massive undertaking for just one kid, let alone 320 every day.
Exactly. And that immense volume is the backdrop for the explosive press conference from Homeland Security Secretary Markwayne Mullin and Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche.
Right, where they made that huge claim.
Yeah, they declared that roughly 300,000 of those children are completely unaccounted for. Secretary Mullin even called the previous handling of this influx, quote, neglect at best and criminal at worst.
Wow.
They are operating under the premise that these children have been systematically handed over to criminal enterprises.
But when you actually trace the origin of that 300,000 figure, you hit this massive discrepancy between the political rhetoric of missing kids and the bureaucratic reality of, missing paperwork.
Yes, that is the core of the debate right there.
Right, because the Acacia Center for Justice, along with the DHS's own internal reporting, they break that number down into 2 very specific buckets.
Right.
You have 291,000 children who were not served notices to appear by ICE, and then another 32,000 who missed scheduled court dates between 2019 and May 2024.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder, if the government knows a child is residing with, say, an uncle in Texas, why is ICE simply failing to print and mail a notice to appear.
Well, because serving an NTA isn't just a matter of dropping a letter in the mail, It is the formal initiation of removal proceedings.
Oh, so that this starts the deportation process.
Exactly. It is the legal mechanism that starts the clock on deportation. So often, ICE actively delays serving that court notice because a child might actually be eligible for asylum or special immigrant juvenile status or some other form of protective relief.
So they're holding off on purpose.
Yes, the interagency friction here is massive. You've got USCIS maybe processing an asylum claim, so ICE holds off on the NTA to let that protective process play out.
That makes a lot of sense.
And furthermore, immigration advocates have heavily documented that an unserved NTA or even a missed court date does not magically equate to a child being in physical danger.
Right, it's not an Amber Alert.
No, not at all. In a huge percentage of these cases, the child is living with a verified family member going to a local public school, but the bureaucratic machinery simply hasn't aligned to serve the correct legal documents. Or maybe the sponsor moved to a new apartment and the address database just wasn't synced.
So if we look at this through corporate analogy, it is like looking at a stack of thousands of returned mail items and unsent meeting invites and immediately concluding that all those employees have been kidnapped.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Right. It takes a known logistical failure, like database synchronization, and assigns a deeply malicious criminal outcome to every single instance.
Yeah, it is a massive conflation of administrative absence with physical absence. You are essentially assigning a cartel abduction to a clerical error.
Okay, but I want to push back on that for a second.
Sure.
Because even if we concede that the vast majority of that 300,000 is purely a missing paperwork problem, we still have the February 2024 HHS Office of Inspector General audit.
Right, the OIG report.
Yeah, that was an internal watchdog looking at the actual safety protocols.
Yeah.
And they found that in 22% of the case files, the agency failed to conduct timely follow-up wellness calls.
Yes, they did find that.
And even more alarmingly, 16% of the files lacked proof that the sponsors underwent the required safety checks.
Yeah, those numbers are concerning.
I mean, if you apply a 16% failure rate to 475,000 children, you are talking about 76,000 kids released into the country without verified safety checks.
Right.
Even if the missing narrative is overblown by politicians, a blind spot of 76,000 children is a catastrophic vulnerability, isn't it?
It is, but we have to be careful with how we interpret a failed wellness check in this context.
Okay, how so?
Well, the OIG audit notes that a failed call often just means a caseworker dialed a number and it went to voicemail.
Oh, so they just didn't pick up.
Right. Think about who these sponsors are. They are frequently undocumented immigrants themselves, working multiple under-the-table jobs with really long hours.
Right, they're probably terrified to answer the phone.
Exactly. They might not pick up an unknown number from a federal government area code out of sheer fear of deportation, even if the child is sitting safely right there in the living room doing their homework.
So a missed call does not automatically equal a child in danger.
Exactly. However, to your broader point, you are absolutely right about the vulnerability. Even if a failed safety check is an administrative oversight 90% of the time, that remaining 10% represents thousands of children released into completely unverified environments.
Which is terrifying.
It is. The administration's rhetoric might be hyperbolic regarding the sheer 300,000 number, but the underlying systemic weakness is entirely real. And the DOJ indictments prove that transnational criminal organizations studied that exact weakness and industrialized it.
And the industrialization of that weakness is what the DOJ is calling the super sponsor phenomenon.
Right.
And the data here is staggering. They identified over 15,500 individuals who have each sponsored at least 3 unrelated unaccompanied minors.
Wild.
3 completely unrelated children handed over to a single adult. And ORR data shows 81,000 addresses that were used repeatedly to house children.
Yeah, the duplicate addresses.
I have to stop right here because how on earth does a modern government database process the exact same residential address 81,000 different times for unrelated children without triggering a massive system-wide lockdown?
Sounds impossible, right?
It really does. I mean, we have credit card algorithms that freeze your account if you buy gas in 2 different zip codes, but the federal government doesn't notice a single house absorbing dozens of kids.
It is a phenomenal question, and it really comes down to the catastrophic state of legacy IT infrastructure within the federal government.
So it's just old tech.
Old tech, but specifically the lack of cross-agency deduplication logic. You have Customs and Border Protection, CBP, making the initial apprehension. Then ORR handles the placement, and ICE supposedly manages the long-term tracking.
Okay.
Those databases historically do not talk to each other in real time.
You're kidding.
No, I'm serious. A caseworker inside an ORR facility is looking at a specific case file for a specific child. They are entering an address into a localized field to approve a release.
Right.
Unless the system is hard-coded to run a real-time query against the entire historical database of every address ever used, which requires massive computing resources and integrated data lakes that ORR simply did not have. That caseworker has absolutely no idea that the address they just typed was used by a different caseworker in a different state 3 weeks ago.
So they're essentially operating in complete silos, just trying to empty beds.
Exactly. And criminal syndicates understood that siloed architecture perfectly.
They exploited the IT gap.
They absolutely did. If we look at the unsealed indictments in the Northern District of Ohio, the mechanics of this fraud become chillingly clear.
Yeah, let's talk about that case.
So you have the case of Maritza Azucena Kawakak and her brother Carlos. From December 2020 to October 2023, they operated a highly sophisticated smuggling ring.
Right.
Maritza didn't just submit a few applications, She systematically submitted sponsorship forms using fraudulent Guatemalan consular ID cards and forged birth certificates to falsely claim she was a close relative of these children.
And the forgery wasn't even that sophisticated, which is the crazy part.
No, it wasn't.
The Assistant Attorney General noted that she was submitting photographs of herself literally holding other people's ID cards.
Yes.
She was submitting visual evidence of her own fraud, and the caseworker stamped it approved.
It's unbelievable.
The government released multiple children to her, and prosecutors tracked systematic payments deposited directly into her bank accounts. This was a revenue stream subsidized by the federal government's placement system.
And when federal agents finally executed a raid on Maritza's home in Cleveland, they uncovered the reality of that revenue stream.
What did they find?
They found Maritza, 8 other adults, most of whom were undocumented, and some of whom had actually been previously processed as unaccompanied minors themselves, and 4 minor children, all crammed into a single residence.
Wow.
It was a localized hub for labor exploitation. She was literally using the ORR system to order labor directly to her doorstep.
That is just, yeah, it's horrifying. But while the Cleveland case focuses heavily on labor and financial exploitation, the 1-2 sentencing exposes the absolute worst-case scenario for physical safety.
Yes, that case is deeply disturbing.
It is. This is a 27-year-old man who hired a coyote to smuggle a 14-year-old Guatemalan girl into the U.S. He submits a sponsorship application, flat out lies and claims to be her brother, and the government hands her over.
Just like that.
Once he has physical custody, he sexually assaults her multiple times. The prosecutors documented that he told her the abuse was her repayment for the smuggling debt he incurred, bringing her over.
Sickening.
He was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But again, I have to ask, how does a 27-year-old man claim a 14-year-old girl and no one verifies the biological relationship? Like, how does that slip through?
To understand how that happens, you really have to look at the immense statutory and legal pressure caseworkers were under during the previous administration.
Okay, what kind of pressure?
You have to understand the Flores Settlement Agreement. This historically dictates that children cannot be held in federal detention facilities for prolonged periods because those environments are inherently traumatizing.
Right, you don't want kids growing up in a detention center.
Exactly. So the overarching policy mandate was to release children to sponsors within 30 days.
30 days.
Yes. And when you have 320 kids arriving every day and a strict mandate to get them out the door in 30 days, velocity becomes the only metric that matters.
So they just had to move them fast.
Right. Caseworkers were forced to accept superficial proof of identity, like a photograph of an ID, because waiting for a forensic analysis of a Guatemalan birth certificate would take 3 months, which completely violates the 30-day mandate.
So the system was literally designed to optimize for speed, even if it meant flying blind on security.
Yes, exactly. The OIG audit showed that 19% of the time, children were released before FBI fingerprint background checks and state child abuse registry checks were fully completed.
19%.
Right. The mandate was just get the child out of the institutional detention center. And the tragic irony is that in their desperation to save children from the trauma of federal detention, they bypassed the exact security filters designed to save them from predators like Juan Tulsi.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the massive policy whiplash we're seeing now.
Oh, absolutely.
The new administration, under acting OR Director Angie Salazar, looked at the super sponsors, looked at the 81,000 duplicate addresses, and basically decided to entirely rewrite the rulebook.
They did.
The new vetting protocols are essentially what you would expect from the most rigorous domestic foster care placements.
Right, it's a completely different world now.
You want to sponsor a child. You must provide valid, forensically verify identity documents. You must pass a completed FBI fingerprint background check before the child is released.
Yep.
If you claim to be a family member, they are no longer taking your word for it. They are requiring mandatory DNA testing to prove the biological link. They are verifying your income, and they are mandating physical, in-person home visits by federal agents before approval.
It is a complete inversion of the previous philosophy. They have basically replaced the velocity mandate with a strict verification mandate.
And what has been the impact of that?
Well, the statistical impact of that inversion has been immediate and drastic. First off, the total volume of arrivals has plummeted. In 2025, we saw only 22,833 unaccompanied children enter the system, which is a massive drop from the 118,000 average we saw previously.
That's a huge drop.
It is, but the most critical metric here is the custody duration. In fiscal year 2024, the average time a child spent in federal custody was 30 days. In FY 2025, under the new vetting rules, that jumped to 117 days.
Wow.
And by May of 2026, the average custody time reached 206 days.
206 days. Let's really think about what 206 days means for a listener right now. That is nearly 7 months of a child's life spent inside a government holding facility.
Yeah.
7 months sleeping on a cot, eating institutional food, entirely isolated from their family, simply waiting for bureaucracy to clear.
It's an agonizing trade-off.
And the administration is defending this by stating they are prioritizing child safety over placement speed.
Yeah.
Secretary Mullen is essentially arguing that keeping a child in a sterile federal facility for 200 days is a necessary acceptable cost if it prevents even one teal-she scenario.
But you have human rights organizations and immigration advocates screaming that this is not a solution. It is just a different flavor of abuse. They are arguing that these ultra-strict policies have erected an impenetrable paperwork barrier. When you mandate DNA testing and FBI fingerprinting for tens of thousands of sponsors, you immediately hit a severe bottleneck.
Because the system can't process it fast enough.
Exactly. The FBI does not have unlimited personnel to process these checks. ORR does not have unlimited field agents to conduct in-person home visits in all 50 states.
Yeah, that's a massive logistical hurdle.
It is. The advocates argue that the government has effectively instituted indefinite detention for minors. They've replaced the hypothetical risk of a trafficker with the guaranteed psychological deterioration of institutional confinement.
And the tragedy that recently unfolded in Chicago proves that institutional confinement carries its own horrific risks.
Yes, that case is heartbreaking.
We have a case where a U.S. citizen father, possessing a perfectly valid birth certificate, stepped forward to claim his toddler daughter. But because of this new labyrinth of mandatory vetting, he was trapped in a bureaucratic holding pattern. He had to wait 5 months just for the government to schedule a fingerprinting appointment. Not to process the prints, but just to get the appointment on the calendar.
Just for the appointment, yeah.
And during those 5 months, while his toddler daughter was sitting in a federal facility deemed safe by the government, she was sexually abused inside the facility.
It is the ultimate nightmare scenario for policymakers. The administration instituted these draconian rules specifically to protect children from sexual abuse by fraudulent sponsors.
Right.
But the logistical friction created by those rules kept a child locked in a facility long enough for her to be abused under the government's own roof. It obliterates the argument that a federal facility is a perfectly safe holding pen.
It totally undermines their whole premise.
It does.
Well,
When you warehouse children for 200 days, the risk of internal abuse, neglect, and severe mental health crises scales exponentially. You also have loving, verified family members who are forced to watch their children languish behind chain-link fences simply because the federal government lacks the logistical bandwidth to swab a cheek and run a background check in under 6 months.
it feels like we are watching a pendulum swing from a reckless free-for-all on one side straight into a bureaucratic brick wall on the other.
That's exactly what's happening.
We stopped the traffickers, but we locked the kids in the vault. And we built the vault so tight that the real parents can't even get inside.
Yeah, it's an impossible situation.
Looking at the sheer scale of the mechanics we've discussed today, the legacy IT systems, the lack of field agents, the interagency friction, is it even possible for a federal agency to balance rigorous fraud-proof vetting with humanitarian speed? Or is the system just fundamentally broken at this scale?
Based on the operational data, it is structurally impossible at this specific scale without a massive, unprecedented injection of resources.
Okay, so it's a resource issue.
Primarily, yes. The architecture of ORR was designed to handle a trickle of cases, carefully vetting a few thousand children a year. When you force 475,000 children through that exact same pipe, the physics of the bureaucracy break down.
The pipe bursts.
Right. You either drop the safety filters to keep the line moving, which gives you super sponsors and 81,000 duplicate addresses, or you enforce the safety filters strictly and the line grinds to a halt, which gives you 206-day detentions and the horrors of the Chicago case.
So they're trapped.
Until the agency has modern, integrated databases that can automatically flag fraud and a massive expansion of personnel to conduct rapid vetting, policymakers are trapped in an agonizing binary. They are forced to choose which type of harm they are willing to tolerate, the risk of release, or the certainty of detention.
And that reality strips away all the simple political talking points. If we synthesize everything we've looked at today, we see an incredibly tangled web.
Very tangled, yeah.
On one hand, the previous administration system was undeniably exploited. The existence of 15,500 super sponsors is a systemic failure of epic proportions, and horrific actors use the 30-day mandate to turn child sponsorship into a trafficking business.
But on the other hand, labeling hundreds of thousands of children as missing broadly misrepresents the structural reality of the immigration backlog.
Right.
The vast majority of that 300,000 figure represents unserved court notices and delayed wellness checks, not mass abductions. Yet the current administration's attempt to fix that vulnerability has engineered an entirely new humanitarian crisis, warehousing traumatized children for upwards of 200 days just to process paperwork.
Which leaves us staring at a system where every attempted solution seems to forge a new tragedy.
Unfortunately, yes.
And it leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to ponder on your own after we wrap up today. If building a perfectly secure, fraud-proof system requires keeping an innocent toddler locked inside a federal detention center for over half a year, at what point does the cure of government protection become just as damaging as the disease of the broken border?
That is the question we all have to ask.
Thank you so much for joining us as we work through the mechanics of this incredibly heavy topic. If you found this breakdown valuable, please take a second to like, subscribe, share this with a friend, and follow the show so we can keep bringing you these deep dives. We will see you next time.